Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The drive to Copper Ridge took me through winding mountain roads that seemed to get narrower with each mile. I was running a true crime podcast called Buried Truth that had gained a modest following over the past 2 years. Nothing huge, maybe 15,000 regular listeners, but enough to make me feel like I was doing something worthwhile. At 34, I'd left my job as a paralegal to pursue this full-time, living off savings and the occasional Patreon donation. The tip about Copper Ridge came through an anonymous email with screenshots of financial records that didn't add up, suggesting the sheriff's department was skimming seized drug money. The sender claimed 3 people who'd tried to expose this had either disappeared or died in accidents over the past 5 years. I checked into the Mountain View Lodge around 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday in late October. The place was one of those old-fashioned motor lodges with doors that opened directly to the parking lot, painted a faded turquoise that probably hadn't been refreshed since the 90s. The woman at the front desk, mid-50s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, barely looked at me as she slid the key across the counter. Room 12. When I mentioned I was a podcaster looking into local stories, her fingers tensed on the keyboard, and she suddenly became very interested in something on her computer screen. The whole check-in process took less than 3 minutes, and she didn't say a single word beyond the room number and the Wi-Fi password. My first stop was the local diner, Rosie's Kitchen, a place with checkered floors and red vinyl booths that looked frozen in time. I ordered coffee and pie, setting my recorder on the table. I always kept it visible so people knew our conversations might be recorded. The waitress, a younger woman with bleached blonde hair and a name tag reading Amber, kept glancing at it nervously. When I asked her how long she'd lived in Copper Ridge, she mumbled something about needing to check on other tables and practically ran away. An older man in overalls at the counter turned to look at me, and I noticed his John Deere cap had a small pin on it, a sheriff's badge replica. He stared for a full 10 seconds before turning back to his eggs. The pattern continued everywhere I went that first evening. At the gas station, the attendant suddenly remembered urgent inventory work when I introduced myself. At the small grocery store, conversations between locals died the moment I walked in, leaving an uncomfortable silence broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights. Even the teenager working at the pizza place seemed to have been coached. When I asked about any interesting local stories, he just shrugged and said, "Nothing ever happens here, mister. We like it quiet." But his eyes kept darting to the door, like he was expecting someone to walk in and catch him talking to me. That night in my motel room, I reviewed my notes and started outlining the episode. The anonymous tipster had mentioned a woman named Dolores Craven who'd tried to file a complaint about missing evidence money back in 2016. According to the email, she'd died in a house fire 2 weeks later. I found her obituary online, survived by a daughter, Hannah, who still lived in town. I made a note to try finding her the next day. As I worked, I became aware of footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate. They'd pause right in front of room 12, stay there for maybe 30 seconds, then continue. This happened 3 times between 10 and midnight. Each time, I looked through the peephole but saw nobody. The parking lot lights cast strange shadows, and I could hear dogs barking somewhere in the distance. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of my doorknob rattling. Not like someone trying to get in with a key, but testing it, seeing if I'd forgotten to lock it. I lay there in the dark, perfectly still, watching the thin strip of light under the door. A shadow moved across it, back and forth, back and forth. Then I heard whispering, at least 2 voices, maybe 3, too muffled to make out words. My phone was on the nightstand, and I slowly reached for it, ready to call 911. But then I remembered. The police were exactly who I was investigating. The whispering stopped, the shadows disappeared, and I heard car doors slamming in the parking lot. An engine started, idled for a moment, then drove away slowly, gravel crunching under the tires. I didn't sleep after that. When the sun finally came up, I packed my recording equipment, a Zoom H6 recorder, 2 lavalier mics, and my laptop, into my camera bag and headed out for breakfast. The same woman from yesterday was at the front desk, and she watched me leave without acknowledging my nod. At Rosie's kitchen, I found Hannah Craven's name in the phone book they kept by the register. She worked at the town's only bank, so I figured I'd try to catch her during lunch break. The morning passed slowly as I drove around town, taking pictures and recording ambient sound. Copper Ridge had maybe 3,000 people, clustered around a main street that had seen better days. Half the storefronts were empty, their windows either boarded up or covered with faded "for lease" signs. The sheriff's department occupied a newer building on the edge of town, all tinted windows and security cameras. I parked across from the bank around noon and waited. Hannah came out at 12:15, mid-30s, auburn hair, wearing a conservative gray pantsuit. I approached her carefully, introducing myself and mentioning her mother's name. The color drained from her face immediately. She looked around frantically, then grabbed my arm and pulled me into the alley between the bank and a defunct hardware store. "You need to leave," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Today, right now. Don't go back to your room. Don't talk to anyone else. Just get in your car and drive." When I asked about her mother, she shook her head violently. Mom thought she could fight them. She thought evidence and truth mattered. They burned her alive in her own home and made it look like she fell asleep with a cigarette. She didn't even smoke. Her eyes were wild with fear. "They know you're here. They know why. If you don't leave..." She didn't finish the sentence, just squeezed my arm hard enough to leave marks and hurried back to the bank. Her warning echoed in my head. But I needed my equipment. Everything for my podcast was in that motel room. Thousands of dollars worth of gear plus all my research notes. I drove back to the Mountain View Lodge, telling myself I'd just grab my stuff and get out. The parking lot was empty except for my rental car and an old pickup truck I hadn't seen before. As I approached room 12, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, not kicked in but open just enough that I could see darkness inside. My key was still in my pocket. I pushed the door open with my foot and felt my chest tighten. The room had been torn apart. My laptop was smashed on the floor, keys ripped out and scattered like broken teeth. The Zoom recorder was in pieces, circuit boards exposed and memory cards missing. Even my clothes had been shredded and thrown around. But it was the wall above the bed that made me step back. In what looked like motor oil, someone had written, "Last warning." I heard footsteps on gravel behind me and spun around. 3 men stood there blocking my path to the car. The one in the middle wore a sheriff's deputy uniform, complete with badge number 247, and a nameplate reading Briggs. He was maybe 45, with a thick mustache and cold blue eyes that didn't blink enough. The other 2 were in civilian clothes but had that same cop stance, weight balanced, hands ready. Deputy Briggs smiled, but it was all teeth, no warmth. "Looks like you've been vandalized, friend. Real shame. Copper Ridge used to be such a safe place." He stepped closer and I could smell stale coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "You should file a report. Course, investigating property crime can be real difficult. Sometimes we never find who's responsible." The man to his left, younger with a scar through his eyebrow, laughed quietly. "Maybe you should head home," Briggs continued. "Nothing good comes from stirring up dirt in small towns. Sometimes dirt's better left buried. You understand what I'm saying?" I understood perfectly. My mouth was dry, but I managed to nod and say I'd be leaving immediately. Briggs patted my shoulder, his grip just a little too firm, fingers digging into the muscle. "Smart man. And hey, don't worry about the mess. Checkout isn't till 11 tomorrow, so take your time cleaning up." Another laugh from his buddies. They walked away slowly, taking their time, making sure I watched them leave. I grabbed what little I could salvage: my phone, car keys, wallet, and surprisingly, one memory card that had rolled under the dresser. Everything else was destroyed. I threw it all in my car and started driving, not even bothering to close the motel room door. As I passed the sheriff's department on my way out of town, I saw Briggs's cruiser in the parking lot. He was leaning against it, watching me drive by. He gave a little two-finger salute off his forehead, and I knew he'd be watching until I crossed the town limits. I drove for 3 hours straight before stopping, my heart still racing every time I saw a police car. When I finally felt safe enough to pull over at a rest stop near Knoxville, I checked the memory card on my phone. It had about 20 minutes of ambient sound from the town, nothing useful. But then I remembered something Hannah had said about evidence and truth mattering. I'd been recording our conversation with my phone in my jacket pocket, a habit from years of journalism work. The audio was muffled but clear enough. I had her confession about her mother's murder, Deputy Briggs's threats, all of it. I uploaded everything to 3 different cloud services immediately. The episode I released 2 weeks later didn't name Copper Ridge specifically. My lawyer advised against it, but I told the story. About the town where nobody talks, where asking questions gets your room ransacked, where deputies make threats in broad daylight. The anonymous tipster never contacted me again, and I never went back. Sometimes I Google Copper Ridge, Tennessee corruption to see if anything's changed, but nothing ever comes up. Hannah Craven moved away 6 months after my visit, according to her Facebook. I hope she found somewhere safe. As for me, I stick to investigating cold cases now. Stories where all the dangerous people are already dead or in prison. Some dirt really is better left buried, at least while the ones who buried it are still carrying badges. I drove into Oak Hollow on a Thursday afternoon with 3 cameras, a stack of release forms, and enough optimism to fill a documentary grant proposal. At 32, I'd been chasing stories through forgotten corners of America for half a decade, scraping by on arts funding and the occasional streaming license. My beat-up Subaru carried everything I owned, including the recording equipment that had become my lifeline to making sense of the world. Small-town ghost stories were my specialty, the kind of local legends that got whispered about in diners and passed down through generations like heirlooms nobody really wanted but couldn't throw away. Oak Hollow sat 40 miles from the nearest interstate, population 847 according to the faded sign at the town limits. Main Street stretched for maybe 6 blocks, lined with buildings that hadn't seen fresh paint since the Clinton administration. I'd picked this place specifically because of an email from a librarian named Dorothy, who'd seen my last documentary online. She'd written about the town's collection of supernatural tales, particularly one about a hanging tree where Confederate deserters had met their end. The stories themselves weren't unique. Every southern town had its share of Civil War ghosts. But Dorothy mentioned something that caught my attention. She said the locals had footage, actual video recordings from the 1980s of unexplained phenomena. That kind of archival material could make or break a documentary. The library stood on the corner of Main and 2nd, a brick building with tall windows that caught the afternoon light. Dorothy turned out to be younger than her emails suggested, maybe mid-40s with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She greeted me at the door with an enthusiasm that seemed forced, her eyes darting to the street behind me before ushering me inside. The place smelled like old paper and lemon furniture polish, that particular scent that made every small-town library feel like a time capsule. She'd already pulled boxes of materials for me to review, newspaper clippings, photographs dating back to the 1920s, and 3 VHS tapes labeled simply "Evidence" in shaky handwriting. We spent that first afternoon in the library's basement, where she'd set up an old television and VCR for me to review the tapes. The first video showed grainy footage of the town square at night. The camera focused on a large oak tree near the courthouse. For 20 minutes, nothing happened except the occasional car passing by. Then, at the 21-minute mark, 3 distinct shapes appeared beneath the tree, translucent figures that seemed to sway in a non-existent breeze. The second tape contained interviews with townspeople from 1987, each describing encounters with what they called the Hanged Men. But it was the third tape that made me lean forward in my chair. This one showed a town meeting, maybe 30 people gathered in what appeared to be this very library. They weren't discussing ghosts. They were talking about protecting Oak Hollow from outside influences and maintaining the natural order. The meeting cut off abruptly when someone noticed the camera. Dorothy stood behind me during that third tape, her breathing shallow and quick. When I asked about the meeting, she mumbled something about community watch programs from the 80s and changed the subject. She gave me a list of locals who'd agreed to be interviewed, 5 names with addresses and phone numbers written in her neat script. Sherman Briggs owned the hardware store and had lived in Oak Hollow for 70 years. The Fitzgerald sisters ran the diner and supposedly had stories about their grandfather's encounters with the hanged men. Edgar Vance worked at the gas station and claimed to have photographed strange lights near the old tree. Dorothy assured me they were expecting my calls, that she'd already explained my project, but her hands trembled as she handed me the paper, and she kept glancing at the basement stairs, like she expected someone to come down. I checked into the Magnolia Motor Inn that evening, the only accommodation in town besides a few rental cabins near the lake. The owner, a woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Nadine, seemed friendly enough until I mentioned why I was in town. Her expression shifted like a door closing, though she still gave me the key to room 12 and pointed out where the ice machine was. My room overlooked the parking lot and beyond that, Main Street. From my window I could see the courthouse and that oak tree from the video. As darkness settled over Oak Hollow, I sat at the small desk with my laptop, transferring footage from the library and making notes. Around 9 o'clock I noticed something odd. Cars kept driving slowly past the motel, their headlights sweeping across my window. Not many, maybe one every 15 minutes, but they all slowed down as they passed, like they were checking to see if my car was still in the lot. The next morning, I started my interviews early. Sherman Briggs met me at his hardware store before it opened. A tall man with deep-set eyes and hands, scarred from decades of manual labor. He told me about the hanged men while organizing boxes of nails, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. According to him, 3 Confederate deserters were lynched by townspeople in 1864 for trying to steal food and supplies. Their bodies hung from that oak tree for 3 days before anyone cut them down. Every full moon since, people claimed to see them swaying in the breeze. Sherman had photos, old Polaroids showing blurry shapes beneath the tree. But halfway through our interview, his demeanor changed. He kept glancing at the store's front window, and when I asked about other strange occurrences in town, he suddenly remembered urgent inventory work in the back room. The interview ended with him practically pushing me out the door, muttering that he'd said too much already. The Fitzgerald sisters were even stranger. I found them at their diner during the breakfast rush, 2 women in their 70s who moved in perfect synchronization, like they'd choreographed every step. They agreed to talk, but kept contradicting each other. Marlene would start a story about lights in the woods behind their property, and Louise would interrupt to say it never happened. Louise would mention visitors who disappeared in the 60s, and Marlene would laugh it off as gossip. The other patrons in the diner watched our conversation with undisguised interest. Forks paused halfway to mouths, coffee cups suspended in mid-air. When I asked about the town meeting from the 1987 video, both sisters went silent. The entire diner went silent. The only sound was the hiss of bacon on the griddle and the slow drip of coffee into a pot. Marlene finally leaned across the table and whispered that some stories weren't meant for outsiders. They refused to sign the release forms. By noon, I'd struck out with Edgar Vance, too. He wasn't at the gas station, and when I asked his co-worker where to find him, the young man just shook his head and went back to wiping down pumps that were already clean. I drove to the address Dorothy had given me, a small house on the outskirts of town. Edgar's truck sat in the driveway, but no one answered the door despite my repeated knocking. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see someone moving inside. On my way back to the car, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. Block letters in black ink. Stop asking questions. Leave tonight. The paper was crisp and new, like it had just come from a printer. I looked around the quiet street. No one in sight, but curtains twitched in windows, and I had the distinct feeling of being watched from multiple directions. I went back to the library to find Dorothy, but the building was locked despite the hours posted on the door, showing it should be open until 5. Through the glass doors, I could see lights on inside and movement in the back office. I called the number she'd given me and it rang once before going to a generic voicemail. Something had shifted in Oak Hollow since yesterday. The few people I passed on the sidewalk avoided eye contact, crossing the street rather than walk past me. Even the teenager working at the coffee shop acted like I was invisible when I tried to order, serving the customer behind me instead. By 3 o'clock, I'd made a decision. I'd gather what footage I had, maybe try one more interview, then leave first thing in the morning. But when I got back to my motel room, I discovered my laptop missing from the desk. Nothing else had been touched. My wallet still sat on the nightstand. My camera equipment appeared intact. Just the laptop with all my transferred footage was gone. Panic set in as I searched the room, checking under the bed, in the bathroom, everywhere. The window was still locked from the inside, and the door showed no signs of forced entry. Nadine claimed she hadn't seen anyone near my room when I confronted her at the front desk. Her eyes wouldn't meet mine, and she kept wiping the same spot on the counter over and over. I demanded she call the police, and she actually laughed, a short, bitter sound. She told me the sheriff was probably busy, that things had a way of working themselves out in Oak Hollow. That's when I noticed the row of keys behind her. Room 12's spare hung on its hook, but the metal looked freshly cut with bright scratches around the teeth. Someone had made a copy recently. I grabbed my camera bag and headed for my car, decision made. I was leaving now, forget waiting until morning. But my Subaru wouldn't start. The engine turned over once, sputtered, then died. I popped the hood to find cables cut clean through, the ends still shiny where metal met metal. As I stood there staring at the sabotage, cars began pulling into the motel parking lot. Not all at once. First one pickup truck, then a sedan, then another truck. They parked in a loose semicircle around my car, engines running, headlights on despite the afternoon sun. No one got out. They just sat there, waiting. I recognized one of the trucks from my interview that morning. Sherman Briggs behind the wheel, his scarred hands gripping the steering wheel. More vehicles pulled up along the street, blocking both directions. That's when Dorothy appeared, walking across the parking lot with measured steps. She looked different than yesterday, older somehow, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. She stopped 10 feet away and spoke in a voice that carried despite its softness. She said I had 2 choices. I could hand over all my equipment, all my notes, everything related to my documentary, and they'd arrange for someone to drive me to the county line. Or I could be stubborn, and Oak Hollow would handle things the way they'd handled Curious Outsiders since 1864. The way they'd handled a journalist in 1987 who'd filmed that town meeting. The way they'd handled anyone who threatened to expose what really happened under that oak tree. Not to Confederate deserters, but to anyone who asked too many questions. I gave them everything. Every memory card, every note, even the backup drives I'd hidden in my spare tire compartment. They knew about those too. Sherman and another man I didn't recognize loaded it all into a metal drum and doused it with gasoline right there in the parking lot. The smoke from my burning work rose black against the evening sky, while Dorothy watched with an expression that might have been regret or satisfaction. I couldn't tell which. They made me stand there until every last piece was ash. Then a younger man with nervous eyes and shaking hands got behind the wheel of a rust-spotted Chevy and told me to get in. We drove in silence for 40 minutes, him gripping the wheel like it might escape, me trying to memorize every detail I could. At the county line, marked by a crooked sign and nothing else, he pulled over. Before I got out, he turned to me with tears actually streaming down his face. He whispered that his sister had come to Oak Hollow in 2015 to study folklore for her thesis. They found her car at the bottom of Miller's Pond 6 months later. He shoved something into my hand, a flash drive tiny and black, then screamed at me to run. I hitchhiked to the next town and caught a Greyhound back to Atlanta that same night. For weeks, I was too scared to look at that flash drive. When I finally did, I found dozens of files, police reports, newspaper clippings, missing persons cases spanning decades. all outsiders who'd come to Oak Hollow and vanished. The journalist from 1987, yes, but also a civil rights worker in 1963, a geology student in 1979, a travel blogger in 2018. The last file was a video, shaky phone footage of that same oak tree. But this time, the shapes beneath it weren't translucent or ghostly. They were solid, swaying bodies, fresh and real. The date stamp showed 3 days ago, while I was in town. I've moved 4 times since then, but sometimes I still get calls from blocked numbers. When I answer, there's only silence, and then Dorothy's voice, soft and certain, reminding me that they know where I am. That Oak Hollow has a long memory and longer reach, that some towns keep their secrets by any means necessary, and the real ghosts aren't the ones that haunt, they're the ones that hunt. The thing about small towns is they usually feel safe, predictable even. That's what I thought when I pulled into Cedar Ridge on a Thursday evening in late September. I was driving from Boston to Pittsburgh for a job interview, and my GPS said this was the halfway point. Perfect place to rest for the night, I figured. The town looked postcard perfect as I drove down Main Street. Old brick buildings, American flags on every porch, kids riding bikes. I checked into the Riverside Inn around 7, and the woman at the desk, Mrs. Garrett, seemed friendly enough. She handed me the key to room 12, then paused, her fingers still gripping the keychain. "You planning on going out tonight?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that made me look up from signing the receipt. I told her I was thinking about grabbing dinner somewhere, maybe taking a walk to stretch my legs after the long drive. Mrs. Garrett's face changed then, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. She leaned forward across the counter, lowering her voice even though we were the only ones in the lobby. "Listen, hun, I'd recommend you stay in after dark. Order room service if you're hungry. We've had some troubles lately, break-ins, couple of assaults. Police can't seem to catch whoever's doing it." She straightened up, smoothing down her cardigan like she was embarrassed by her own warning. "Just being neighborly," she added with a tight smile. I thanked her for the heads up, but didn't think much of it. Every town has its problems, right? Besides, I'd grown up in cities where you actually had to watch your back. How dangerous could a place like Cedar Ridge really be? After settling into my room, I decided to ignore Mrs. Garrett's warning. The sun was still up, casting long shadows across the street, and I was starving. The diner I'd spotted on my way in was only 3 blocks away. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, noticing how quiet the streets were for early evening. Usually, you'd see people walking dogs, watering lawns, normal suburban stuff. But the sidewalks were empty except for an older man sitting on his porch across the street. He watched me walk by, didn't return my wave, just stared with this intense focus that made me walk a little faster. The diner was nearly empty too. Just me, a trucker in the corner booth, and a waitress who kept glancing at the windows. I ordered a burger and tried to make small talk, but she barely said 2 words beyond taking my order. The whole atmosphere was weird, like everyone was waiting for something bad to happen. By the time I finished eating, darkness had settled over the town like a heavy blanket. The streetlights were on, but they seemed dimmer than they should be, creating more shadows than light. I paid quickly and stepped outside, immediately noticing how the temperature had dropped. But that wasn't what made me stop in my tracks. Across the street, I saw 2 men walking slowly down the sidewalk, and one of them was carrying what looked like a baseball bat. They weren't talking, weren't hurrying, just walking with this deliberate pace, heads turning left and right like they were looking for something, or someone. I ducked back into the diner's entrance, pretending to check my phone while watching them pass. Once they turned the corner, I started walking back to the inn, taking a different route than I'd come. That's when I saw more of them. Residents out on their porches, in their driveways, all holding something. Golf clubs, crowbars. One woman even had what looked like a machete. They weren't being subtle about it either. I kept my head down and walked faster, but not too fast. Didn't want to look like I was running from something. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, matching my pace perfectly. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I sped up, they did too. I risked a glance back and saw 3 people about 20 feet behind me. A middle-aged man in a flannel shirt carrying a tire iron, a younger guy with a hockey stick, and a woman holding something I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. They weren't trying to catch up, just following, maintaining that exact distance. My heart was hammering now, and I had to force myself not to break into a run. The inn was still 4 blocks away, and every house I passed seemed to have someone standing guard outside, watching me go by with cold, suspicious eyes. Some of them fell in behind the group following me, creating a growing parade of armed locals trailing me through their streets. Then things got worse. Up ahead, I saw a pickup truck pull out from a side street and stop right in the middle of the road, blocking my path. 2 men got out, leaving the doors open, engine running. One had a shotgun, not pointed at me, but held in a way that made it clear it could be in a heartbeat. The other was holding a length of chain, wrapping one end around his fist. "Evening," the one with the shotgun said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet night. "Don't think we've seen you around here before." I stopped walking, very aware that the group behind me had stopped too, forming a loose semicircle. I explained I was just passing through, staying at the Riverside Inn, tried to keep my voice steady and normal. The man nodded slowly, like he was thinking it over. "That's so. Mrs. Garrett check you in?" When I confirmed she had, he exchanged a look with his partner. "Funny thing is, we've been having some problems lately. Strangers coming through, causing trouble. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke. I told them I'd just arrived that evening, showed them my room key as proof, even offered to let them call Mrs. Garrett to confirm my story. But I could see in their faces that they'd already made up their minds about me. The man with the chain stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of beer on his breath. "See, that's the thing," he said, voice low and menacing. "Last break-in was at the Hendricks place, just 2 houses down from the inn. Happened 3 nights ago, right around the time their security camera caught someone who looked an awful lot like you casing the property." I started to protest that I'd been in Boston 3 nights ago, but he cut me off. "We take care of our own here in Cedar Ridge. Police can't do nothing, so we handle things ourselves." The crowd behind me murmured agreement, and I heard the distinctive sound of someone pumping a shotgun. My mouth went dry as I realized these people weren't interested in the truth. They needed someone to blame, and I was the unlucky outsider who'd wandered into their crosshairs. That's when I noticed something that made my situation even worse. Several of the people surrounding me had what looked like dried blood on their clothes. The woman with the machete had dark stains on her sleeves. The man with the tire iron had specks of something on his boots that looked suspiciously like blood spatter. These weren't just paranoid citizens protecting their neighborhood. They'd already hurt someone, maybe multiple someones. And now they had me surrounded, a convenient scapegoat for their troubles. "Look," I said, trying one more time to reason with them. "I understand you're all scared and angry, but I'm not your guy. I've got a job interview in Pittsburgh tomorrow morning. Check my car, check my phone, whatever you need to do, but please just let me go back to the inn." The man with the shotgun actually smiled at that, but it was the coldest smile I'd ever seen. "Oh, we'll check all right. Boys, why don't you help our friend here back to his car? We'll have ourselves a little look-see." The way he said it made it clear that getting to my car was going to be the least of my problems. They closed in around me, not touching, but making it clear I had no choice but to move where they wanted. We walked as a group back toward the inn, me in the center of their armed circle. Other residents came out of their houses to watch our procession, some joining the mob, others just staring from their porches with grim satisfaction. When we reached the inn's parking lot, I saw my car sitting alone under a flickering streetlight, looking impossibly far away even though it was only 50 feet. The man with the shotgun gestured with the barrel. "Keys." I handed them over with trembling fingers, and he tossed them to the guy with the chain. While they searched my car, throwing my belongings onto the asphalt, ripping apart my overnight bag, I noticed Mrs. Garrett watching from the inn's lobby window. Our eyes met for a second before she quickly drew the curtain shut. She'd known this would happen. That's why she'd warned me to stay inside, not because of some mysterious criminals, but because of what the town itself had become. Well, 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 the man with the chain called out, holding up something from my car. It was just my tire iron from the emergency kit, but the way he displayed it to the crowd, you'd think he'd found a smoking gun. Look what our friend here was hiding. Bet this would make a real nice tool for breaking into houses, wouldn't it? The crowd muttered angrily, pressing closer. I tried to explain it came with the car, that everyone had one, but my words were drowned out by their accusations. Someone shoved me from behind, not hard, but enough to make me stumble. Then another push from the side. They were working themselves up, feeding off each other's anger and fear. The man with the shotgun raised his hand for quiet. "Here's what's going to happen," he announced. "You're going to get in that car and drive out of Cedar Ridge. Tonight, right now. And if we ever see you again, if you even think about coming back through here." He pumped the shotgun for emphasis. Well, let's just say we know how to deal with problems permanent-like. I should have been relieved they were letting me go, but something in his tone made me hesitate. The way the crowd was positioned, the eager looks on their faces, this felt like a setup. But what choice did I have? I walked to my car on unsteady legs, very aware of dozens of eyes tracking my every movement. My scattered belongings were still strewn across the parking lot, but I didn't dare stop to collect them. I just got in, started the engine, and put it in reverse. That's when I saw it in my rearview mirror. Several of the mob members were already heading for their vehicles. They were going to follow me, make sure I left town. Or maybe they had something else in mind for when I reached the town limits, some lonely stretch of road where no one would hear or see what happened. I pulled out of the lot slowly, and sure enough, 3 sets of headlights fell in behind me. The main road out of town was a winding 2-lane highway through thick woods, no streetlights, no houses, just darkness and trees. Perfect place for an accident. My speedometer crept up as I tried to put distance between us, but they matched my speed, staying right on my tail. Then, just as we reached the town limits sign, they started flashing their high beams and honking their horns. In my mirror, I could see someone leaning out a window, waving that tire iron they'd taken from my car. I floored it then, pushing my old sedan as fast as it would go on those dark curves. But they kept pace, and I realized with growing horror that they knew these roads better than I did. They could predict every turn, every straightaway. Just when I thought I'd gained some distance, I came around a sharp bend and saw another pickup truck parked sideways across both lanes, completely blocking the road. I slammed on the brakes, tires screaming, and managed to stop just feet from the truck. In my mirrors, the vehicles behind me screeched to a halt, boxing me in. This was it, the real plan. They'd never intended to let me leave. I was trapped on a dark road with a mob that had already tasted blood, and nobody knew where I was. But then, something unexpected happened. A state police cruiser came around the bend from the opposite direction, lights flashing. The trooper had to stop because of the truck blocking the road, and suddenly his spotlight was illuminating the whole scene. Me boxed in by multiple vehicles, armed people getting out of their cars. The mob members hesitated, caught in the act. The trooper stepped out, hand on his weapon, and spoke into his radio. Within minutes, 2 more cruisers arrived. Turns out the state police had been getting reports about Cedar Ridge all week. Not about break-ins, but about the town's increasingly violent vigilante problem. They'd already arrested 6 people for assault and false imprisonment. The criminals the town was so afraid of? They didn't exist. It was just paranoia feeding on itself until anyone who wasn't local became a target. I gave my statement at the state police barracks and drove straight through to Pittsburgh, no stops. Got the job too, though I was a mess in the interview. Cedar Ridge made the news a few weeks later when the feds got involved. Turns out, I wasn't the first traveler they'd cornered, just the first lucky enough to escape. Look, I know how this sounds when I type it all out, but I swear on everything that what happened to me in Fairfield is real. I'm Claire, And at 29, I was teaching 4th grade in Chicago when I got the call that my grandmother Catherine had passed. We weren't super close. She'd moved to this tiny place called Fairfield years ago after my grandfather died, and I maybe visited twice my whole life. But somehow, she left me her house. My parents said it was because I was the only one in the family who still sent her Christmas cards, which honestly made me feel pretty guilty. I was going through a rough divorce at the time. My ex-husband had taken half of everything, and frankly, I needed somewhere to go that didn't cost me a fortune in rent. The timing felt like a sign from the universe, you know. A fresh start in a small town where nobody knew about my failed marriage or the mess I'd made of my life in the city. The drive to Fairfield took about 3 hours through winding country roads that seemed to get narrower the further I got from civilization. When I finally pulled up to Catherine's house, my house now, I guess, it was this old Victorian place with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that creaked when the wind hit it. The realtor had given me the keys weeks ago, but seeing it in person was different. It sat on about 2 acres, surrounded by these massive oak trees that blocked out most of the sunlight, even in the middle of the day. The nearest neighbor was maybe half a mile down the road, which I thought was perfect at the time. I remember thinking how peaceful it would be, how I could finally get my head straight without the constant noise of traffic and sirens. The moving truck had already dropped off my stuff the day before, so boxes were stacked everywhere inside. That first night I ordered pizza from the only place in town that delivered and sat on the porch steps, watching fireflies dance around the yard. It felt like the beginning of something good, something healing. The weirdness started on my 3rd morning there. I came out to get the mail and found this folded piece of notebook paper tucked under the door knocker. No envelope, just plain lined paper with words scrawled in blue ink. Go back to the city. My first thought was that it was some kind of prank from local kids, maybe testing the new person in town. Small towns can be weird about outsiders, right? I crumpled it up and tossed it in the kitchen trash, figuring it was just someone being juvenile. But then 2 days later, there was another one. Same handwriting, same blue ink, but this time it said, "Don't open the window at night." That one made my skin crawl a little. Not gonna lie, it was way more specific, more personal somehow. Like whoever wrote it knew something about my habits or was watching to see which windows I kept open. I started locking my doors at night after that, even though I'd never been the paranoid type before. The notes kept coming, maybe every few days, always appearing when I wasn't looking. "You don't belong here." She tried to warn them. The trees remember everything. Each one got stranger than the last, and the handwriting started looking more frantic, like whoever was writing them was getting agitated. I tried staying up late a couple times to catch whoever was leaving them, but I never saw anyone. The person was either really good at staying hidden or they knew my schedule better than I thought. What really bothered me was that last note. She tried to warn them. It had to be talking about Catherine, my grandmother. But warn them about what? I realized I didn't know much about her life in Fairfield, or why she'd moved to such an isolated place. My parents had always brushed off her stories as the ramblings of an old woman, but now I was starting to wonder if there was more to it. Something was definitely not right in this town, and I was beginning to think Catherine had figured that out too. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I went digging. The Fairfield Library was this tiny brick building downtown with maybe 3 computers, and a librarian named Dolly, who looked like she'd been there since the place opened. She was actually super helpful when I explained I was Catherine's granddaughter and wanted to learn more about her time in town. Turns out my grandmother had been quite the frequent visitor to the police station. Dolly pulled out these old filing boxes from the back room, and holy hell, what I found in there made my head spin. Police report after police report, all filed by Catherine Morrison between 2013 and early this year. Break-in attempts, footprints on her porch that didn't match any shoes she owned, strange noises at night, and, get this, multiple reports about hooded figures standing in her yard between 2 and 3 a.m. The cops had clearly thought she was losing it, because half the reports had notes scribbled in the margins like, elderly woman, possible dementia, and no evidence found at scene. But here's the thing that made my chest tight. Every single report described exactly what I'd been experiencing. The timeline matched up perfectly with when she'd stopped calling my parents as much, when she'd started sounding paranoid, according to my mom. Catherine hadn't been losing her mind at all. She'd been dealing with the same creepy stalkers that were now focused on me. One report from November really stood out, because she'd written in shaky handwriting at the bottom, "They want me gone, but if I leave, they'll just wait for the next person." Jesus, she'd known this would happen to whoever inherited the house. She'd tried to protect future owners by staying put, enduring whatever these people were doing to her. And now that she was gone, they'd moved on to me. I photocopied every single report and drove home with this sick feeling in my stomach, knowing that Catherine had spent her final years living in the same fear I was just starting to understand. The next logical step was getting cameras, right? I wasn't about to spend months filing useless police reports like Catherine had. I drove to the hardware store in the next town over and bought 4 wireless security cameras with night vision. The guy at the store, this older dude named Pete, was super helpful and even offered to come install them for me. When I told him the address, though, his whole demeanor changed. He got this weird look on his face and started talking really fast about how he was booked solid for the next few weeks. I ended up installing them myself, 1 pointing at the front door, 1 at the back, and 2 covering the sides of the house where the yard met the tree line. The setup took me most of a Saturday, but by Sunday night, I had everything connected to an app on my phone. I'm not gonna lie, I was actually excited to finally catch these weirdos in the act. I figured once I had proof of who was doing this, I could take it to the state police and actually get some real help. The footage I got that first week was absolutely insane. On Tuesday night around 2:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I pulled up the live feed and nearly dropped the damn thing. 3 people in dark hoodies were walking slowly around my house in a perfect circle. Not jogging, not rushing, just this deliberate, methodical pace like they were performing some kind of ritual. What made it even creepier was that none of them ever looked directly at the cameras. It was like they knew exactly where each one was positioned and deliberately kept their faces turned away. They'd walk past a camera, and right at the moment when their face should have been visible, they'd turn their head just enough to stay in shadow. The whole thing lasted about 20 minutes, and then they just melted back into the trees like they'd never been there. I watched that footage probably 50 times, trying to make out any identifying features, but it was useless. All I could tell was that one was shorter than the others, and they all moved with this eerie coordination that made my skin crawl. After seeing that footage, I barely slept for 3 days. I kept checking the cameras obsessively, jumping at every little sound the old house made. The notes stopped coming after I installed the cameras, which should have made me feel better, but somehow it made everything worse. It was like they were changing tactics, escalating to something I couldn't predict. On Friday night, I took 2 sleeping pills because I was becoming a complete wreck. Bad decision. Around 4 a.m., I woke up to the most horrible sound I've ever heard. My home security alarm blaring like the world was ending. I stumbled out of bed, still groggy from the pills, and checked my phone. The app showed that the back door sensor had been triggered. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears as I crept toward the kitchen, grabbing a baseball bat from the hall closet. When I got to the back door, it was standing wide open, letting in the cold morning air. But here's the thing that really messed with my head. There were absolutely no signs of forced entry. No broken locks, no damaged wood, nothing. The door was just open. I called 911 immediately, and 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later. Officer Thompson and Officer Banks, both local guys who clearly thought I was just another paranoid city girl making a fuss over nothing. They walked around the house, checked the door frame, asked if I was sure I'd locked it before bed. The younger one, Thompson, kept giving me these looks like I was wasting their time. They spent maybe 15 minutes total before telling me it was probably just an old lock that didn't catch properly and that I should get it replaced. But I knew I'd locked that door. I'd been obsessive about it since the note started. As they were leaving, Banks mentioned that my grandmother used to call them about similar things all the time. "Old houses, you know," he said with this dismissive shrug. "They settle funny sometimes." I wanted to show them the camera footage of the hooded figures, but something about their attitude made me keep my mouth shut. These guys had clearly written off Catherine as a crazy old woman, and they were doing the same thing to me. After the cops left, I was too wired to go back to sleep, so I made coffee and sat in the kitchen trying to make sense of what had happened. That's when I noticed the refrigerator door was slightly ajar. I walked over to close it, and that's when I saw something that made my entire world tilt sideways. There, sitting on the middle shelf between a carton of milk and some leftover Chinese takeout, was a single folded piece of paper. My hands were trembling as I pulled it out and opened it. It was a photocopy of an official death certificate, Catherine's death certificate. But the date had been whited out and changed to tomorrow's date in black ink. And underneath, in that same frantic blue handwriting from all the notes, someone had scribbled, "Yours will look the same." I literally had to grab the counter to keep from falling down. Someone had been inside my house, had access to official documents about my grandmother's death, and was essentially telling me I was going to die tomorrow. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a direct threat on my life. That moment was my breaking point. I wasn't going to end up like Catherine, slowly driven insane by these psychos until I died alone and scared. I grabbed my phone and called my brother James in Denver, told him everything that had been happening, and begged him to come help me. He's a private investigator, and while he thought I was being dramatic at first, when I texted him photos of the death certificate and some of the camera footage, his tone completely changed. "Pack a bag right now," he said. "Don't sleep there tonight. I'm driving out and I'll be there by morning." I threw some clothes in a suitcase, grabbed all of Catherine's police reports and my camera equipment, and drove to a motel in the next town over. The whole way there, I kept checking my rearview mirror, convinced I was being followed. But you know what? For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. When James arrived the next morning with two of his buddies from his army days, we went back to the house together. The front door was standing wide open, and pinned to it was one final note: "Running won't save you." But James took one look at everything I'd collected, made some calls to contacts he had with the state police, and within 48 hours, 3 people were arrested. Turns out it was a local family, the Carters, who'd been trying to buy Catherine's land for years to expand their meth operation in the woods behind the house. They figured if they scared off anyone who inherited it, they could eventually get it cheap at a tax auction. James's military connections and my documentation finally got someone to take it seriously. The Carters are in prison now, and I still live in that house. Sometimes I think about Catherine and how she died thinking she'd failed to protect me, when really, her meticulous record-keeping is what saved my life. People always ask me why I chose to focus on abandoned places for my photography. Truth is, there's something about decay that tells a story better than any pristine building ever could. The peeling paint, broken windows, and overgrown weeds, they all whisper secrets about the lives that once filled those spaces. In August 2018, I was working on a historical documentation project about forgotten institutions across New England. That's what brought me to Ashford, Vermont, a tiny village tucked away in the mountains where most GPS systems lose signal about 3 miles before you actually arrive. I'd heard whispers about an old asylum there, the Hillcrest State Hospital, which had been shuttered since the late 1980s. At 32, I'd photographed dozens of similar places, but something about this one felt different even before I set foot in town. Maybe it was the way people's voices would drop to a whisper whenever they mentioned Ashford, or how online forums about abandoned places had surprisingly little information about Hillcrest despite its size and history. The drive into Ashford felt like stepping back in time. The main road was barely wide enough for 2 cars, flanked by towering pine trees that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. When I finally reached what passed for the town center, I counted maybe 15 buildings total. A gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, a small grocery store with faded Coca-Cola signs, and a diner called Murphy's that had seen better decades. The people I encountered were polite enough, but there was something guarded about their interactions. When I mentioned I was a photographer interested in local history, their smiles would become forced, and conversations would quickly turn to the weather, or how I should probably head back to the main highway before dark. The clerk at the gas station, a weathered man named Frank with calloused hands and suspicious eyes, told me flat out that there wasn't much to photograph around here. But when I casually brought up Hillcrest, his entire demeanor changed. He suddenly became very interested in organizing the cigarette display behind the counter, mumbling something about how that old place had been torn down years ago. The way he avoided eye contact told me everything I needed to know. Hillcrest was still standing, and for some reason the locals didn't want outsiders knowing about it. I decided to try a different approach and headed to Murphy's Diner, hoping the coffee would be better than the information I'd been getting. The place was dimly lit with those old-style booth seats that had probably been there since the 1960s, cracked vinyl held together with electrical tape. There were only 3 other customers, an elderly couple sharing a piece of apple pie and a middle-aged woman reading a paperback novel while nursing what looked like her 3rd cup of coffee. The waitress, who couldn't have been older than 25, had that small-town friendliness that felt genuine until I mentioned why I was in town. Her name tag read Bethany, and she had strawberry blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, with tired eyes that suggested she'd been working double shifts for weeks. When I asked about historical sites in the area, particularly anything related to the old hospital, Bethany's pen stopped moving across her order pad. She glanced nervously toward the kitchen, then leaned in closer and lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "Look, mister, I don't know what you heard about this place, but there ain't nothing up there worth seeing. That building's been empty for decades, and it's not safe. Foundations crumbling, roofs caved in, and the whole place is probably full of asbestos." What struck me as odd was how specific her warnings were for someone who claimed there was nothing to see. She rattled off details about structural damage and environmental hazards like she'd given this exact speech before, multiple times. But it was what happened next that really got my attention. As she was talking, the kitchen door swung open and an older man emerged, probably the cook or owner. And the moment he saw Bethany talking to me, his face darkened. He didn't say a word, just gave her a look that made her straighten up immediately and change the subject to the daily specials. The whole interaction lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it was clear that discussing Hillcrest was absolutely forbidden. After that, Bethany became almost robotic in her service, refilling my coffee without making eye contact and practically throwing the check on my table. As I left, I noticed the older man watching me through the window, his arms crossed and his expression grim. I had the distinct feeling that word about the nosy photographer was already spreading through town, and that made me more determined than ever to find out what they were all so desperate to hide. I spent the rest of the afternoon driving around the outskirts of town, looking for any road that might lead to the old hospital. Most of the side roads were unmarked dirt paths that disappeared into thick forest, and my sedan wasn't exactly built for off-road exploration. Finally, about 4 miles north of town, I found what looked like an old service road partially hidden behind a rusted metal gate that had been left slightly ajar. The chain that should have secured it was hanging loose, as if someone had recently cut through it and tried to make it look intact from a distance. Weeds had grown up through cracks in the asphalt, and tire tracks in the mud suggested this route was still occasionally used despite its abandoned appearance. The road wound uphill through dense pine forest for about 2 miles before opening into a clearing, where I got my first glimpse of Hillcrest State Hospital. The building was massive, easily 4 stories tall with 2 long wings extending from a central structure. Even from a distance, I could see that most of the windows on the upper floors were boarded up, while others gaped like empty eye sockets. The red brick facade was stained with decades of weather, and ivy had claimed large sections of the exterior walls. As I approached the main building, my excitement was tinged with unease. The front entrance was secured with heavy chains and a sign warning about trespassing, but like the gate below, someone had clearly been here recently. Fresh cigarette butts were scattered near the steps, and I could see footprints in the mud leading around to the side of the building. The structure itself was in better condition than Bethany had claimed. Sure, there was obvious decay and damage, but it was far from the crumbling ruin she'd described. Most telling were the windows on the ground floor, which had been boarded up from the inside rather than the outside, suggesting someone was actively trying to keep people from seeing in, rather than simply securing an abandoned property. I walked the perimeter of the building, documenting everything with my camera, when I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. In what appeared to be the administrative wing, one of the boards covering a first-floor window had come loose, leaving a gap just wide enough to peer through. What I saw inside made me realize that this place wasn't as abandoned as everyone wanted me to believe. The hallway was dusty but not decrepit, and more importantly, there were fresh tire tracks in the grime on the floor, as if someone had been wheeling equipment or furniture through recently. I managed to find a side entrance where the lock had been broken, probably by previous urban explorers or vandals. The heavy metal door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the sound echoed through what felt like miles of empty corridors. The smell hit me immediately, not the musty odor of abandonment I expected, but something sharper, almost clinical, like disinfectant mixed with old paper and something else I couldn't quite identify. The interior was a maze of long hallways lined with doors, most of which were locked or blocked. Emergency lighting strips along the baseboards were still functional, casting an eerie green glow that made everything look like it was underwater. As I explored deeper into the building, I started finding things that didn't belong in an abandoned asylum. In what had once been the main reception area, I discovered a desk that looked like it had been used recently, with coffee ring stains and pen marks that seemed fresh. There were filing cabinets that had been left unlocked, and when I opened one, I found manila folders containing documents that made my photographer's curiosity turn into something closer to fear. The papers were photocopies of old medical records, but not the kind you'd expect to find in a normal psychiatric facility. The documents I found were disturbing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Patient files from the 1960s and 1970s detailed treatments that sounded more like torture than therapy. Electroshock sessions administered at voltages far beyond standard practice, experimental drug cocktails with no apparent medical purpose, and surgical procedures that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance rather than provide healing. What made it worse was that many of these files had recent handwritten notes in the margins, as if someone had been studying these old records and taking notes. One file in particular caught my attention, a patient identified only as Subject 47, who had undergone something called cognitive restructuring therapy over a period of 18 months. The description of the treatment was vague but chilling, involving sensory deprivation, chemical restraints, and what the notes referred to as perception modification techniques. But the most unsettling discovery was a newer document paperclipped to the old file, a modern psychological evaluation form with today's date on it, filled out in careful handwriting for someone identified only by initials. The symptoms described matched almost exactly what Subject 47 had exhibited 50 years earlier. Someone was not just studying these old experimental procedures, they were apparently still using them. I was so absorbed in reading these horrific documents that I almost didn't hear the car engines approaching outside. When the sound finally registered, my heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Through the grimy window, I watched as 3 vehicles pulled into the clearing, 2 pickup trucks and what looked like a police cruiser, though I couldn't make out the department markings from this distance. Car doors slammed shut, and I could hear voices, muffled but urgent. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped inside a building with only one unlocked entrance, and that entrance was exactly where these people were heading. I quickly stuffed several of the most damaging documents into my camera bag and tried to find another way out. The building was a labyrinth of locked doors and dead ends, but I finally found a rear exit that led to what had once been a loading dock. The door was rusted shut, but adrenaline gave me the strength to force it open just enough to squeeze through. As I slipped outside, I could hear heavy footsteps echoing through the hallways I'd just been exploring, along with voices calling out instructions to check every room and find anything that doesn't belong here. I managed to circle around through the woods to where I'd parked my car, staying low and moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. My hands were trembling as I fumbled with my keys, and I kept expecting to hear shouts or see flashlight beams cutting through the trees around me. The drive back down the mountain was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept checking my rearview mirror, convinced I would see headlights following me, but the road remained empty. When I finally reached the main highway, I didn't stop driving until I was 3 towns away, where I pulled into a 24-hour truck stop and sat in my car trying to process what had just happened. The documents I'd taken were spread across my passenger seat like evidence of some unthinkable crime, and I realized that my simple photography project had stumbled into something far more sinister than I could have imagined. The people of Ashford weren't just protecting the memory of an old asylum. They were protecting an ongoing operation that had apparently been running in secret for decades. And now they knew that someone had discovered their secret. Over the next 3 days, I became convinced that I was being watched. It started with little things. The same blue sedan appearing in my rearview mirror on 2 different routes home from work. A man in a baseball cap who seemed to be reading the same newspaper at 3 different coffee shops I visited. Phone calls where no one spoke when I answered. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, but the feeling was too persistent to ignore. On Wednesday evening, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar, even though I was certain I'd locked it. Nothing appeared to be missing, but everything felt wrong. Drawers that were opened slightly differently than I'd left them. Books on my shelf arranged in a subtly different order. My computer still warm, even though I hadn't used it all day. The documents I'd hidden in a safety deposit box were still secure, but clearly someone had been looking for them. That night I barely slept, jumping at every creak of the building and every car that passed on the street below. I knew I had to make a decision. Either go to the authorities with what I'd found or try to disappear and hope they'd eventually lose interest in me. The decision was made for me Friday morning when I found a note slipped under my door. Written in block letters on plain white paper, it simply read, "Return what you took, forget what you saw. This is your only warning." That afternoon, I drove to the state police headquarters and handed over copies of all the documents to a detective named Captain Jennifer Walsh. She listened to my story with the kind of professional skepticism you'd expect, but when she saw the files, her expression changed completely. Within hours, I was being interviewed by federal agents, and by Monday morning, the news was reporting that a major investigation had been launched into alleged illegal medical experimentation in rural Vermont. 3 months later, 18 people were arrested, including the sheriff of Ashford, 2 doctors who'd been running what they called private research, and several townspeople who'd been paid to keep outsiders away. The asylum was finally shut down for real this time, and I testified in court about what I'd discovered. I never did finish that photography project. Some stories are too important to be art. But every time I drive through small towns now, I can't help but wonder what other secrets might be hiding behind boarded-up windows and friendly warnings to stay away. The gas station attendant wouldn't meet my eyes when I asked about the missing hikers. That should have been my first warning sign. I'd driven into Blackwater on a Thursday afternoon in September 2014, following a trail of disappearances that stretched across 3 counties. As a freelance journalist, I'd covered everything from corporate fraud to small-town corruption, but this story had a different weight to it. The attendant, a wiry man with grease-stained fingernails, kept glancing at the sheriff's office across the street while he filled my tank. He muttered something about folks getting lost in the mountains all the time, then practically threw my change at me before hurrying back inside his booth. Blackwater wasn't on any tourist maps, and now I understood why. The main street had maybe 12 buildings, half of them boarded up with sun-bleached plywood. Paint peeled off the remaining storefronts like diseased skin, and the few people I saw walking around moved with purpose, heads down, avoiding eye contact. I parked outside Mabel's diner, the only place that seemed to have any life to it, and grabbed my notebook and recorder. Through the window, I could see locals hunched over coffee cups, their conversations dying the moment I pushed through the door. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. I slid into a booth near the back, trying to appear casual while every pair of eyes tracked my movement. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, approached with deliberate slowness. Her name tag read Gladys, and her smile never reached her eyes. I ordered coffee and the daily special, then asked if she'd heard about the hikers who'd gone missing last month. Her hand trembled slightly as she poured my coffee, and a few drops splattered on the checkered tablecloth. "We don't talk about that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Best if you don't either." Before I could ask what she meant, she'd already retreated to the kitchen, leaving me with more questions than answers. The sheriff walked in 20 minutes later, and I knew it was him before seeing the badge. He had that unmistakable swagger of small-town authority, shoulders squared like he owned every inch of the place. Sheriff Clayton, according to the brass nameplate on his uniform, was built like a former high school quarterback gone to seed, broad chest, thick neck, and hands that looked like they could crush walnuts. He made a beeline for my booth, sliding in across from me without invitation. "Heard we got ourselves a reporter asking questions," he said, his pale blue eyes studying me like I was something scraped off his boot. "Gladys called you?" I asked, and he just smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Everyone calls me when strangers come sniffing around. That's how we keep things peaceful in Blackwater." "Just doing my job, Sheriff. 3 hikers have vanished in this area over the past 2 months. Their families deserve answers." I kept my voice steady, professional, but my pulse quickened when his jaw tightened. He leaned forward close enough that I could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "Those folks got themselves lost in the mountains. Happens every year when city people think they know better than locals about these trails. Nothing sinister about it." His tone suggested the conversation was over, but I pressed on. "Their cars were found at different trailheads, all within 5 miles of town. Seems odd they'd all get lost so close to civilization." Clayton's smile vanished entirely, replaced by something cold and dangerous. "You'd be surprised how fast these mountains can swallow someone up. Weather changes, trails disappear, and suddenly you're turned around with no way out. Best advice I can give you, finish your meal and head back where you came from. Tonight." I spent the rest of the afternoon driving around, taking photos of the abandoned buildings and the 3 trailheads where the hikers' vehicles had been discovered. Each location had the same characteristics: isolated parking areas surrounded by dense forest, no cell phone service, and trails that seemed well maintained for about 100 yards before becoming overgrown and barely visible. At the second trailhead, I found something the initial reports hadn't mentioned: fresh tire tracks leading off the main path into the woods, too wide to be from a regular car. When I followed them on foot, they ended abruptly at a cleared area where the ground had been recently disturbed. The earth was darker there, turned over like someone had been digging. I took photos from every angle, my unease growing with each click of the camera. By 5 o'clock, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I decided to check into the town's only motel, a rundown place called Pine Rest Inn that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 70s. The desk clerk, a nervous young man with acne scars and darting eyes, handed me a key to room 12 after I paid cash up front. "You planning to stay long?" he asked, fidgeting with a pen. When I said maybe a few days, he shook his head quickly. "Most folks just pass through. Not much to see in Blackwater." As I headed to my room, I noticed him pick up the phone and dial. speaking in hushed tones while watching me through the office window. The room smelled like mildew and old cigarettes, with a bed that creaked under my weight and a TV that only picked up static. I spread my notes and photos across the bedspread, trying to piece together a pattern. Around 8 that evening, I walked to the town's records office, hoping to find historical documents about missing persons cases. The building was supposedly open until 9, according to the faded hours painted on the door, but it was dark inside. I peered through the window and could make out filing cabinets and boxes of documents in the moonlight. That's when I noticed movement in the reflection. Someone standing about 30 feet behind me. I turned around to see a man in dirty overalls watching from across the street. When our eyes met, he didn't look away or pretend to be doing something else. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, waiting. I walked back toward the motel and he followed at the same distance, never getting closer but never falling behind. 2 more people joined him along the way, emerging from the shadows between buildings like they'd been waiting. By the time I reached the pine rest, there were 5 of them, all maintaining that same eerie distance, all watching. I locked my door and pushed the dresser in front of it, then called my editor, Carla, back in Philadelphia. The connection was terrible, crackling with static, but I managed to tell her about the sheriff's threats and the disturbed ground I'd found. "Get out of there," she said immediately. "This isn't worth it. We'll send someone else with backup." But even as she spoke, the line went dead. I tried calling back. Nothing. My cell showed no signal, though I'd had 2 bars just hours earlier. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see them still standing in the parking lot, now joined by 3 more figures. They weren't talking or moving, just standing in a loose semicircle facing my room. Around midnight, I heard the doorknob rattle. Slowly at first, like someone testing if it was locked. Then more insistent, the metal grinding as someone tried to force it. The dresser held, but I could hear breathing on the other side, heavy and deliberate. A different voice, gravelly and low, spoke through the door. "We know you found the digging site. Should have listened to Clayton. Now you're part of the problem that needs solving." The rattling stopped, but I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor in the bathroom with the door locked, my laptop open, uploading every photo and note to my cloud storage while I still had battery power. Around 3 in the morning, I heard engines starting outside, multiple vehicles, their headlights sweeping across my window. Through a tiny bathroom window, I watched a convoy of pickup trucks heading toward the forest, the same direction as those tire tracks I'd found. That's when everything clicked. The missing hikers hadn't gotten lost. They'd stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see, and now I had too. I waited until dawn, then made my move. The parking lot was empty except for my car, which now had 2 flat tires. The sidewalls had been slashed cleanly, deliberately, but I'd come prepared for emergencies and had a can of Fix-A-Flat in my trunk. I worked fast, knowing they were probably watching from somewhere, spraying the foam into both tires just enough to get me moving. The main road out of town was blocked. Sheriff Clayton's cruiser sat sideways across the pavement, and he leaned against it with his arms crossed, waiting. I didn't slow down. Instead, I yanked the wheel hard left onto a dirt service road I'd noticed the day before, my patched tires protesting as I floored it. In the rearview mirror, I saw Clayton scrambling for his vehicle, but I had a head start. The service road was rough, full of potholes and loose gravel, but it connected to the state highway about 8 miles out. Those were the longest 8 miles of my life. 2 pickup trucks appeared behind me after the first mile, gaining fast. My speedometer hit 60 on roads meant for maybe 30, the car sliding around corners, branches scraping against the windows. At one point, they got close enough that I could see the driver of the lead truck, the same man in overalls who'd followed me the night before. He tried to ram my bumper, but I jerked the wheel at the last second, nearly sending myself into a ditch. I made it to the highway with maybe 100 yards to spare, merging into blessed traffic, a stream of normal cars with normal people living normal lives. The trucks didn't follow onto the main road, just sat at the intersection watching me disappear. I drove straight through to Philadelphia, 12 hours without stopping except for gas, constantly checking my mirrors. The story I wrote exposed everything. The pattern of disappearances, the sheriff's obstruction, the midnight convoys, and my own near miss. State police launched an investigation 2 weeks later, but by then, most of Blackwater's residents had scattered. They found human remains at 3 sites in the forest, some dating back 20 years. Clayton and 12 others were arrested, though the full truth of what they were doing, whether it was covering up accidents, hiding bodies for money, or something worse, never fully came to light. I still get nightmares about those people standing in the parking lot, silent and watching, and I've never driven through West Virginia again. The last stretch of road before Hollow Creek looked like something peeled from the pages of a forgotten American ghost story. Flat, endless farmland blurred beneath a sky that couldn't decide between dusk and storm. I was driving cross-country for work, cutting through Nebraska to shave off time, when my truck started sputtering just past mile marker 72. The nearest town on the map was Hollow Creek, and I figured I'd find a mechanic there, maybe grab some food, sleep a night, and be out by morning. I wasn't planning to stay longer than that. Places like Hollow Creek have a way of looking empty without actually being quiet, like the air itself is holding something back. The town had this kind of permanent vacancy vibe. The only lodging I could find was a squat 1-story building with a faded red sign that read Creekside Motel, but most of the letters were missing or hanging by threads. A man at the front desk, who introduced himself as Wendell, handed me a key without much talk. The room was what you'd expect from a place that rents by the hour more than the night. Dusty carpet, wood paneling that smelled like old cigarettes, and a TV bolted into the wall like someone might try to steal it. But I was too tired to care. I dropped my duffel bag, grabbed a sandwich from the gas station across the street, and spent the evening trying to find a signal strong enough to text my supervisor about the delay. The next morning, something small bugged me. My phone charger, which I always plug in on the left side of the bed, was on the right. I figured I'd just been more exhausted than I thought and let it go. But when I came back from seeing the mechanic, who told me they'd need to order a part that wouldn't arrive until the next day, I noticed my toothbrush was facing a different direction in the cup by the sink. Little things, too small to call out, but too specific to be random. I even wondered if Wendell was just nosy and had let himself in for housekeeping, though the place didn't look like it knew what that word meant. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking I heard the doorknob shift or soft clicks from the vent. I chalked it up to nerves. Maybe I'd had too much caffeine. Maybe I was just anxious being stuck in a nowhere town. Still, I slid a chair under the doorknob just in case. It was something I hadn't done since college, but there was this itch in the back of my head I couldn't shake. I left the lamp on and dozed off facing the door, half daring something to prove me right. By the next morning, I knew I hadn't imagined it. My duffel bag was unzipped, just slightly, and I never leave it like that. Worse, my car keys had been moved from the table near the lamp to the bathroom counter. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. No forced entry, no signs of a break-in, nothing missing. But there was something so calculated about how it had been done, like someone wanted me to notice just enough, not to steal, not to scare, to test boundaries. I went to the front desk and asked Wendell if housekeeping had been through, and he just blinked at me like I'd asked him for a steak dinner. Back in the room, I started inspecting the place more carefully. Behind the curtain rod, there was a tiny black dot in the corner of the wall. It looked like an old screw, except it had a faint red glimmer, like an LED trying not to be seen. I climbed on the chair to check and realized it was a pinhole camera wired into the wall. I stood there for a few seconds trying to convince myself it was left over from some forgotten security system, but the wire was fresh. No dust, no corrosion, and it was angled directly at the bed. I felt like I was being watched right then, not through the camera, but through some other set of eyes I couldn't see. I unplugged the lamp, unscrewed the light bulb, flipped the mattress, every surface I could reach. I ended up finding 2 more, one tucked behind the smoke detector and another hidden in a hole drilled under the desk. None of this made sense. I wasn't anyone important. I worked freelance electrical jobs. I didn't owe anyone money. No criminal record, no enemies I knew of. And Hollow Creek wasn't the kind of place where things like this happened by chance. I started feeling like I wasn't just unlucky. I was being selected, targeted even. What got me wasn't just the cameras. It was the fact that someone had installed them recently, and done it with precision. That meant they either knew I was coming, or someone here was choosing guests on the fly. I packed up what little I'd unpacked, called the mechanic, and told him I'd find another shop in the next town over. He paused for a beat too long and said, "You sure about that?" Like he already knew why I was rushing. That tone stayed with me. It was subtle, almost lazy, but there was something underneath it, like he'd been through this dance before with someone else. I didn't even wait to check out. I tossed the key on the nightstand and walked straight to the front office, but it was empty. The blinds were pulled, lights off. Wendell was gone, like he'd never been there. I walked around the back, knocked once, then twice, but no answer. I didn't push it. I just got in my truck and drove down the road to the next service station, praying they'd have what I needed. On the way out of town, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A security camera mounted on a telephone pole near the motel, aimed not at the road but at the parking lot. There was no branding on it, no city markings, just a plain black casing bolted into splintering wood. When I got to the next town over, the mechanic there took one look at the truck and told me the fuel line had been tampered with. Not by Ware, but by someone who knew what they were doing. He showed me where the clamp had been loosened, just enough to cut off pressure but not enough to make it obvious. I asked him how long it would have taken someone to do that. He shrugged and said, "A couple minutes tops." That's when everything clicked. They hadn't been watching me because I stumbled into town. They'd brought me in. I filed a report with the sheriff's department in the next county, but I never heard back. A week later, I got a generic email saying they'd looked into the matter and found nothing unusual. I tried calling once, but nobody returned the message. It didn't matter. I already knew I wasn't supposed to get answers. Hollow Creek wasn't the kind of place that shows up on headlines. It just absorbs people, quietly, neatly, like they were never there. Since then, I don't take back roads. I don't stop in towns that don't show up in search results. I sleep in the truck if I have to. There's something about Hollow Creek that still bothers me, not just because of what happened, but because of how easy it was for them. Like they'd done it before, like they'll do it again.